Let's talk about red blood cells. I'm going to share the screen here. Here we are. So here's a red blood cell. Red blood cells are tasked with delivering oxygen to all of the cells and removing carbon dioxide. They are shaped like this. They are round, and on both sides you have a dent. And really what this is called is biconcave. So concave goes in like this, and it happens on both sides, so these are biconcave. Now, this shape allows the red blood cell to move throughout the cardiovascular system without getting stuck to other structures. So it's like a ball. It bounces off of the blood vessel walls and it bounces off of other red blood cells and typically does not stick to anything or get stuck to any other red blood cells. Now, the fun thing about red blood cells is that they lack a lot of organelles. There's no DNA, there's no nucleus. Red blood cells cannot reproduce themselves. But in the last video, I told you that they're made in the bone marrow, so you probably already guessed that. Now, the cytoskeleton of the red blood cells is really flexible, so that a red blood cell can actually make its way out of a capillary and into the surrounding tissue. And it does so by kind of squeezing itself, almost like a water balloon. If you were trying to put a water balloon through a hole of some kind, you'd have to squeeze it and push it through. And that's how red blood cells do what they do, to deliver oxygen to the tissue. So they're flexible, they're round, they're bouncy, and they carry hemoglobin. So this is a hemoglobin molecule, and it looks big on the screen, right? But there are about 200 to 300 million hemoglobin molecules in each red blood cell. So we are talking really, really small. Now, these squigglies are globins, and they are a protein-like structure, and there are 4 of those within each hemoglobin molecule. And these green things here are the heme. Now, the heme contains iron, and the iron actually binds with oxygen, and one heme molecule can bind with one oxygen molecule, which is O2, right? We're not talking about an oxygen atom, which would be just one oxygen. We're talking about an oxygen molecule, which is O2. So each heme can bind with one oxygen molecule. So if you have all 4 of these heme molecules bound to oxygen molecules, you call this whole molecule oxyhemoglobin. Oxyhemoglobin. And again, you have 200 to 300 million of these inside each red blood cell. So you can see that they can carry quite a bit of oxygen, and we're talking molecular level. So these are not to be seen except with an electron microscope. That's really the only way that you can take a look at something this size. Red blood cells themselves, though, can actually be seen with a really powerful microscope. You don't need an electron microscope to see red blood cells. So these are rather large compared to the hemoglobin molecules themselves. Okay, so the study of blood is called hematology. And sometimes when you go to the doctor's office and they take your blood, they do something called a hemocrit. And the hemocrit really just is talking about how many red blood cells you have in a sample of your blood. And that kind of determines whether or not your oxygen carrying capacity is high or low. And really what they're talking about is something called anemia. And there are different kinds of anemia. Pardon me. You have the iron deficient anemia, which we'll actually talk about in a little bit. And you have something called sickle cell anemia. Now, I don't have a slide for sickle cell anemia, and that's okay. I'll just stop the share for a second. Sickle cell anemia, pardon me, is also called sickle cell disease because it is a genetic disorder, and it affects people of African descent more than it does people of European descent. And what happens with sickle cell disease is that your red blood cells are born sickled or malformed. So instead of being round and bouncy, they're in the shape of a sickle or like a crescent moon. That's the shape that they are. They're crescent shaped. Pardon me. So instead of having a full complement of hemoglobin, they have only partial hemoglobin because they're just in the wrong shape. They can't carry as much hemoglobin. Also, because they are in a sickled shape, they tend to stick together like this. Instead of bouncing off one another, bouncy, 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 they stick together. And when they stick together and form these thick masses of sickled cells, those cells can then lodge themselves in smaller blood vessels, causing strokes, embolisms, and things like that. So one of the main symptoms of sickle cell disease is actually oxygen deprivation, which leads to pain. This is a very painful disease because when the tissues are starved for oxygen, they actually send pain signals to the brain. So that's kind of one of the main symptoms of sickle cell disease. And then, of course, it could be very severe and you could have a heart attack and stroke and things like that. So like I said, this is genetic. It is passed from mother to child. But in order to have sickle cell disease, you actually have to get the trait from both parents. You can have sickle cell trait, which means that you have the actual genetic trait for the disease, but it might not express itself. However, you could pass it on to your offspring if your partner also had the trait. So in order for sickle cell disease to really express fully, you have to get the trait from both parents. Okay. So that's what sickle cell anemia is, and we just call it anemia because anemia is lack of oxygen. So sickle cell disease is really sickle cell anemia. You can use them interchangeably. Now, before we move on to the life cycle of a red blood cell, there's one last thing that I want to mention about blood itself. I think I have mentioned this before because this always gets asked. Blood is not blue in your body. Blood is always red in your body, and I think most of you know that by now. But really the question that people ask is, why does it look blue? Why do your veins look blue? Well, you can see mine, so I'm just gonna hold them up here. No. See that one right there? It looks blue, right? And you can see some here that look blue as well. So if you recall in chapter 11, when we were talking about special senses, and I was specifically talking about vision, I had mentioned that the way that we see color is not necessarily the way color is. It is the absorption of all of the other colors of the visible spectrum and the deflection of one color that is the color essentially that we see. So that's exactly what's happening here. So light is penetrating the skin, the visible spectrum, but the red wavelengths are being absorbed and the blue wavelength is being reflected or bounced off of the blood vessel. And that is why we see these blood vessels as blue. Now, of course, it doesn't mean that the blood is blue. As I mentioned, nobody has blue blood. That's not a thing. Not in humans anyway. Little side note here. So we'll go over here from our little side note box. There are animals with blue blood, actually. In fact, crustaceans, some crustaceans have blue blood. Horseshoe crabs specifically have blue blood. And those little roly-polies that you find under your planters and your pots and things out in your yard. They like moisture, and when you touch them, they roll up into a little ball. Roly-polies or pill bugs, perhaps you've heard them. Those are, one, the only land crustacean. All the other crustaceans are in the water. And two, they do have blue blood. Oh, now there's a thing, full of useless information. But humans don't have blue blood. Mm-mm. Okay, so let's talk about the life cycle of a red blood cell. Red blood cells are in circulation for about 120 days. So they don't live very long as far as a cell is concerned. And every day you have about 2.5 million red blood cells being taken out of circulation. But that's okay, really, because you have trillions of them in circulation at any given time. So what happens is, red blood cells become damaged, or they just age, they wear out. And then the number of red blood cells actually starts to drop. So what happens? Well, let's see if we can share the screen for a second. Let's skip that question here. There we are. Okay. So ultimately, if the number of red blood cells drops, then that means oxygen levels drop. Okay, and in response to this, the kidneys, because they're constantly filtering the blood, secrete a hormone called erythropoietin, which starts the process of new blood cell formation called erythropoiesis. Remember, hemopoiesis was just blood cell formation in general. Erythropoiesis is red blood cell formation. And erythropoietin, the hormone, begins this cycle essentially. So erythropoietin actually stimulates the bone marrow to make more erythrocytes. But erythrocytes don't start out as fully formed red blood cells. They start out as something called reticulocytes. Remember? So, well, actually, the very first cell was a proerythrocyte, and then a reticulocyte, and then a red blood cell. Either way, it doesn't quite matter. So reticulocytes are then released from the bone marrow, and these are just immature red blood cells, and they take about 3 to 5 days, or 1 to 2 days to actually mature, and then the whole cycle takes about 3 to 5 days. They mature into red blood cells, and then you have more circulating red blood cells, which are picking up more oxygen, right? And then erythropoietin, or a hormone release by the kidneys, stops. And then, of course, red blood cell production decreases. So this is a negative feedback loop. Starts with lowering oxygen, then the kidneys release erythropoietin, the bone marrow makes more red blood cells in the form of immature reticulocytes. Then those mature, they're able to carry oxygen, the kidneys perceive this increased level of oxygen, stops releasing EPO, and then no more red blood cells are made at that particular time. Now, of course, you're constantly making red blood cells because this isn't something that's ever going to stop necessarily until you die. But, there are times in your life that you need to make more red blood cells. For example, if you have some kind of hemorrhage event, in other words, you lose blood quickly, perhaps you're in an accident of some kind and you're bleeding profusely. Well, in that case, you are going to be making more red blood cells more rapidly. So in that case, more immature reticulocytes are going to be released into the bloodstream. Another example of when you might make more red blood cells is if you move to an area of high altitude. When you move to an area of high altitude, there is less oxygen in the environment. So, in order to compensate for this lack of oxygen, your body produces more red blood cells. The more red blood cells you have, the more oxygen carrying capacity, and of course, then your body can catch up. So this is kind of what altitude sickness is like when you go on vacation or when you move to someplace like Colorado, let's say. specifically Denver. Denver's pretty high altitude. And when you get there, you don't feel so good. Sometimes you feel really lightheaded or fatigued and pretty crappy overall for a day or two before your body catches up with those red blood cells and then more circulating oxygen to your tissues. So those are two really good examples of when your body might need to make more red blood cells to increase oxygen carrying capacity, hemorrhaging or maybe moving to altitude. Okay? All right, so now let's go back to that review question. Just skipping around a tiny bit. Oops, there it is. What is the extracellular matrix of blood? Is it A, hemoglobin, B, red blood cells, C, plasma, or D, serum? What do you think? If you said C, plasma, you are correct. Very good. Okay. Now, I am going to stop the share for a second. So now we're going to talk about the breakdown of red blood cells. So we're going to finish the blood cell cycle. Okay. Okay. Okay, so on page 259, you have two life lessons. You have polycythemia and anemia, and we're going to talk about anemia in general. So anemia is just a catch-all term for a deficiency of red blood cells or hemoglobin. So there are many different kinds of anemia, and we already talked about sickle cell anemia. There are, the most common one, what we typically call anemia, is actually just iron deficient anemia. And that is that you do not get enough dietary iron to use the heme from the iron to attach it to oxygen, and you have lower circulating oxygen. So you feel fatigued and kind of run down a lot. Maybe you sleep excessively or something like that. Now, this is more of a problem for women simply because we menstruate, so we lose blood every month. So we need to keep our iron up. And honestly, we need to get between 5 and 20 milligrams of dietary iron a day. Now, this can be found in many different kinds of products. Of course, if you eat meat, there it is, red meat specifically. Or if you're a vegetarian, dark green leafies, spinach is a good one. And spinach also has some other things that you need for your blood, like B12 and folate. Those are things that are necessary to make red blood cells as well. It's just we don't talk about those as much because we're focusing on the iron. Okay, so aside from iron deficient anemia, you can also have anemia where your body's just not making enough red blood cells. And this can be for a number of different factors, but a hematocrit will determine that, right? So there are other types of anemia, and one of them is called pernicious anemia. Pernicious anemia is when your body does not absorb B12. Now, this is actually a nutritional issue because there's something called intrinsic factor that's made in your intestines that allows you to absorb B12. If you're not making intrinsic factor, you can't absorb B12, and again, it's another type of anemia. We'll talk a little bit more about that in the digestive system chapter, since that's not really a blood issue. If you have kidney disease, that means that you probably aren't making enough erythropoietin, and if you're not making EPO, you're not stimulating the bone marrow to make more red blood cells, and then you have a deficiency of red blood cells. So kidney disease can lead to anemia. And of course, hemorrhaging, we already talked about. Moving to altitude, you can have anemia for a short period of time. All of these different things can cause anemia. It doesn't necessarily mean that something's wrong with you per se, because like I said, there are a couple of benign things that can cause anemia. But if you are feeling lethargic and sluggish and run down, it may not be a lack of sleep. It could be a lack of oxygen because of red blood cell deficiency. Okay. So the other one then is polycythemia, and this is kind of along the lines of anemia. This is when red blood cells are being created faster than they are destroyed, okay? Um, so this is when you actually have more red blood cells than you need. And this is typically due to an abnormality in the bone marrow. So it could be like a bone cancer of some kind or some kind of genetic disorder. Um, this could also be a secondary polycythemia. And again, it could be due to something like a bone marrow disorder or a cancer. This is, yeah, I'll just stop there. Too much information. I will just stop there. Okay. Now, of course, we also talked about polycythemia when moving to altitude, right? So your body's making more red blood cells to adapt to the lower level of oxygen in the environment. But then when you move back, or when you come back to, let's say, Harrisburg from Denver, you have polycythemia. Your body has more red blood cells than it needs because now you're at a lower altitude, so you don't need as many circulating red blood cells. So again, like anemia, this isn't a disorder in and of itself. It just means that you have more red blood cells than are being destroyed. Okay, and that's really all polycythemia is. Okay, so that's really it for red blood cells. This was kind of long and involved, but we did talk about the life cycle of a red blood cell. So now you know. All right, so when we come back, we will be talking about white blood cells.